November 10, 2004. 0700 hours. Fallujah, Iraq. The Marines of Kilo Company, 3rd Battalion, 1st Marine Regiment, stacked up outside a concrete-walled compound in the Jolan district. The beating heart of insurgent resistance in what would become the bloodiest urban battle American forces had fought since Hughes City in 1968. The air tasted of cordite and burning metal. Somewhere in the gray dawn, a minaret's call to prayer echoed through streets that had been transformed into killing corridors, where every doorway concealed potential death and every window frame offered a sniper's vantage point. The young corporal at the front of the stack, 23 years old with Missouri dirt still under his fingernails from his last leave home, pressed his back against the bullet-puckered wall and felt his heart hammering against his plate carrier. His name doesn't matter for this moment. What matters is that he volunteered to be first through the door, a position that carried a 70% casualty rate in Fallujah's house-to-house fighting, according to the battalion surgeon's grim calculations. Operation Phantom Fury had kicked off 3 days earlier, and already the Marines had learned that Fallujah was unlike any battlefield they'd trained for at Camp Pendleton or 29 Palms. The insurgents had spent 6 months fortifying the city, transforming residential homes into interconnected fortress networks with mouse holes blasted through walls, allowing fighters to move between buildings without exposing themselves to American firepower. They had stockpiled weapons in mosques, rigged entire blocks with improvised explosive devices, and positioned machine gun nests with interlocking fields of fire that turned intersections into death traps. Intelligence reports estimated between 3,000 and 5,000 insurgent fighters were dug into Fallujah's urban maze, a mix of foreign jihadists, former Iraqi military personnel, and local fighters who knew every alley and rooftop. The Marines were outnumbered, fighting in an environment that negated many of their technological advantages, forced into close-quarters battle where survival often came down to who pulled the trigger first in a darkened room. The corporal's fire team had already cleared 7 houses that morning, each one a separate universe of terror and adrenaline. The protocol was brutally simple, yet demanded perfect execution under conditions that shattered men's nerves. Approach the door. Check for tripwires and booby traps while exposed to fire from adjacent buildings. Breach with explosives or a shotgun or a swift boot kick, depending on the door's construction and tactical situation. Throw in a fragmentation grenade if time permitted. Then go through that fatal funnel, the doorway where every insurgent weapon would be aimed, and clear the room in seconds that felt like hours. The corporal had been first through the door on 4 of those 7 clearances, and each time he'd survived felt like a miracle he couldn't count on repeating. His hands shook slightly as he checked his M16A4 for the 100th time that morning, confirming a round was chambered, safety off, magazine seated firmly. Behind him, 3 other Marines pressed close in the stack, their breathing audible through the crack and pop of distant gunfire that provided Fallujah's constant soundtrack. The house they were about to enter was a 2-story structure that intelligence suggested served as a weapons cache and possible command post for insurgent forces controlling this sector of the Jolan. A sniper in an adjacent building had killed a Marine from Alpha Company the previous evening, and the shot had likely come from this compound's upper windows. The company commander wanted the building cleared and secured before the battalion pushed deeper into the district. No air support could help here. The rules of engagement and proximity of civilian structures made close air support too risky in this dense urban terrain. No tanks could fit down the narrow alley. This was rifle work, the kind of fighting that hadn't changed fundamentally since World War II's brutal urban battles in Stalingrad and Aachen and Manila. Young men with guns entering confined spaces to kill other young men with guns, decided by speed and violence of action, and sometimes just dumb luck. The breacher moved up with his shotgun, a Benelli M4 loaded with solid slugs designed to destroy door hinges and locks. The corporal watched him work, watched him check the doorframe for wires, watched him position the shotgun barrel against the first hinge. The morning sun was climbing higher now, and the corporal realized with strange clarity that he was aware of everything. The weight of his helmet, the smell of his unwashed uniform after 3 days of continuous combat, the face of his mother back in Springfield, the girlfriend who'd stopped writing letters 2 months into the deployment, the taste of the protein bar he'd choked down an hour ago. Time dilated in that moment before the breach, the way it always did, the way combat veterans throughout history had described it. That heightened state where the brain processes everything faster, because it knows death might be seconds away. The breacher fired. The shotgun's boom was deafening in the confined alley. The hinge disintegrated in a shower of wood splinters and metal fragments. Second shot. The other hinge exploded. The door sagged inward, hanging by its lock mechanism. The Marine behind the corporal already had a fragmentation grenade in his hand. Pin pulled, safety lever depressed. The breacher kicked the door fully open, creating the entry point, and simultaneously, the grenade went in, a perfect toss that landed somewhere in the interior darkness. Everyone in the stack pressed against the wall, turned their faces away, opened their mouths to equalize pressure. The explosion came, a flat, hard crack that shook the building's foundations and sent a pressure wave rolling out through the doorway carrying dust and smoke. Now, the corporal went through the door, M16 up and ready, moving right as trained because the next man would go left, and they needed to split the room's angles immediately. The interior was darker than expected after the bright morning sun, and his eyes struggled to adjust in the critical first second. The room was large, maybe 15 feet square, with a doorway leading deeper into the house and a staircase climbing to the second floor. Furniture overturned from the grenade blast, smoke obscuring vision, and then movement, a figure rising from behind an overturned couch, AK-47 in hands, muzzle swinging toward the doorway where Marines were flooding through. The corporal fired first. 3-round burst, center mass, the way he'd trained thousands of times. The insurgent went down. Behind him, his fire team was moving, flowing into the room, weapons searching for targets, voices shouting, "Clear!" and "Moving!" in the controlled chaos of close-quarters battle. Another doorway. Another room to clear. The corporal moved toward it, knowing he would be first through this door too, because that's what he did. That's who he was in this moment. The point of the spear. The Marine who went first, so his brothers might have a split-second advantage in the rooms beyond. He stacked up on the interior doorway. Another Marine pressed close behind him. No time for grenades now. They were too deep in the structure, moving too fast to let the enemy reposition. He would go through on speed and aggression alone. He took one breath, said a prayer he didn't know he remembered from childhood Sunday school, and pivoted through the doorway, rifle leading, eyes searching the darkness for the threat he knew was waiting. The room exploded, not metaphorically, literally erupted in a blast of light and concussion and flying metal that picked him up and threw him backward into the Marine behind him. The insurgents had rigged the doorway with an improvised explosive device, probably a mortar round or artillery shell wired to a pressure plate or command detonator. The corporal didn't process this information consciously. His brain simply registered light and sound and impact, and then pain, searing and absolute, radiating from his right hand. He was on the floor. Someone was screaming. He realized it was him. His rifle was gone, blown from his grip by the explosion. Smoke filled the room. His ears rang so loudly he couldn't hear the gunfire that had erupted around him as insurgents in adjacent rooms opened fire on the stunned Marines. He tried to push himself up, tried to get back in the fight, but his right hand wouldn't work. He looked down, and in the smoke and confusion saw something that his mind initially refused to process. His hand was gone. Not gone completely, but transformed into something mangled and wrong, held to his wrist by strips of tissue and shattered bone, blood pumping out in rhythmic spurts that matched his heartbeat. The shock was total. He'd been through the door first, like he'd done before, like he'd volunteered to do, and this time the house had fought back with high explosives and won. The firefight continued around him. Another Marine, his team leader, a sergeant from Tennessee, was dragging him backward, away from the fatal doorway, screaming for a corpsman. The corporal felt strangely detached now, the pain receding into a distant roar as shock and adrenaline flooded his system. He watched his brothers continue the fight, watched them throw grenades into the room that had nearly killed him, watched them push forward because stopping meant dying in Fallujah's unforgiving urban battlefield. A Navy corpsman appeared, 19 years old with hands that moved with practiced efficiency despite the chaos, applying a tourniquet to the corporal's shattered arm, tightening it until the blood flow slowed to a trickle, jabbing a morphine auto-injector into his thigh, marking his forehead with the time of treatment. The corporal's war had lasted 4 seconds after he entered that second doorway. 4 seconds that cost him his hand and changed every assumption he'd held about his future, about his career, his capability, his identity as a Marine and a man. And before we continue with what happened in that house and how this young man survived what should have killed him, we'd like to hear from you. Where are you listening from right now? And what's your connection to these stories of courage and sacrifice? Drop a comment and let us know. Your engagement helps us bring these real histories to more people who need to remember what these warriors endured. Hit that like button if this story is gripping you, because what comes next will test everything you think you know about human resilience under fire. The field hospital at Camp Fallujah was organized chaos when they brought me in. I remember the harsh fluorescent lights after the smoke and darkness of the Jolan, the antiseptic smell cutting through the cordite that still clung to my uniform, the controlled urgency of medical personnel moving between gurneys loaded with Marines who'd paid the same price I had for pushing deeper into the city. A surgeon appeared above me, Navy Lieutenant Commander with tired eyes and steady hands, telling me they needed to operate immediately to save as much of my arm as possible. I nodded, or thought I did. The morphine made everything feel distant and dreamlike, but the pain was real enough. A screaming nerve fire that radiated up from the mangled mess of tissue and bone that used to be my right hand. They wheeled me into surgery within 30 minutes of my arrival. I learned later that speed was critical in these cases. The longer damaged tissue remained attached, the greater the risk of infection, sepsis, systemic shock. The surgeon's job was brutal in its simplicity. Determine what could be saved and remove what couldn't, creating a viable stump that could eventually support a prosthetic while preserving as much arm length and functionality as possible. In my case, the IED had done catastrophic damage. The blast had severed tendons, shattered the carpal bones into fragments too small to reconstruct, destroyed blood vessels and nerves beyond any hope of surgical repair. My hand was attached to my wrist by little more than skin and willpower, and both were failing. I went under anesthesia thinking about doors. All the doors I'd gone through in Fallujah. All the doors I'd go through in life ahead. Or wouldn't. Because how do you open a door with one hand? How do you tie your boots, load a rifle, shake hands with the firm grip your father taught you makes a man? The questions followed me down into unconscious darkness, and when I woke up hours later in the recovery ward, my right arm ended 4 inches below the elbow, wrapped in surgical dressing that was already seeping blood through the gauze. The physical pain was manageable with the medications they gave me, but the phantom pain was something else entirely. My hand was gone, but my brain hadn't gotten the message. I could still feel my fingers, feel them curling and uncurling, feel an itch in my palm that I couldn't scratch because that palm no longer existed. The nurses told me this was normal. That phantom limb sensation affected nearly all amputees, that it might fade with time or might become a permanent companion. I lay in that hospital bed listening to the distant sounds of artillery and airstrikes as the battle for Fallujah continued without me, and I felt my missing fingers drumming against sheets they would never touch again. They medevaced me to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany within 72 hours. The C-130 flight was packed with wounded from Fallujah and other operations across Iraq. Marines, soldiers, sailors, all of us broken in different ways by a war that ground men down like grain between millstones. I was ambulatory, which meant I helped the flight nurses tend to the guys who weren't, holding IV bags with my good hand, talking to a 19-year-old private who'd lost both legs to an IED in Ramadi. He asked me if I thought it was worth it, and I didn't have an answer. I still don't. Landstuhl was where the real fight began, not against insurgents, but against my own body and mind. The surgical team there performed a revision amputation, cleaning up the emergency work done at Camp Fallujah, shaping the residual limb properly, ensuring the bone was beveled and padded with adequate soft tissue to eventually support a prosthetic socket. I went through 3 more surgeries in 2 weeks, each one addressing complications: infection in the bone that required aggressive antibiotic treatment and debridement, neuroma formation where severed nerves tried to regenerate, and instead created painful tangles that had to be excised and buried in muscle tissue. Between surgeries, I started physical therapy. The therapist was a German civilian contractor named Klaus, who'd worked with amputees for 20 years, and he had 0 patience for self-pity. The first day, he had me trying to dress myself with one hand. It took me 45 minutes to put on a t-shirt. I wanted to quit, wanted to call for a nurse to help me, but Klaus just stood there with his arms crossed and his eyebrow raised until I figured it out. Buttons were impossible. Shoelaces were a nightmare. Opening a bottle of water required techniques I'd never considered, because I'd always had two hands to take for granted. Klaus taught me about compensatory strategies, using my teeth, wedging things against my body, leveraging surfaces and edges to accomplish tasks designed for bilateral function. He taught me about the psychological stages of amputation recovery, about how I'd cycle through denial and anger and bargaining and depression before maybe, possibly reaching some kind of acceptance. He was right about the cycle, but he didn't mention how fast you could spin through all those stages in a single day, sometimes in a single hour. The anger was the hardest part. I was angry at the insurgents who'd planted that IED, angry at the intelligence that hadn't identified it, angry at myself for not being more careful, angry at the Marine Corps for sending us into that meat grinder, angry at the politicians who'd started this war, angry at God or fate or whatever cosmic force had decided that I would be the one to trigger that particular bomb in that particular doorway. I took my anger out on physical therapy, pushing myself until Klaus had to physically stop me from damaging the healing tissue. I took it out on the hospital staff, snapping at nurses who were just trying to help. I took it out on myself, lying awake at night cataloging all the ways I'd failed. Failed to spot the IED, failed to protect myself, failed to be the Marine I'd promised to be. The depression came in waves. Some days I could handle it, could focus on the small victories like successfully using a fork or managing to shower without assistance. Other days, the weight of everything I'd lost crushed me flat. I'd see guys in the ward who'd kept their limbs, who'd be returning to duty after recovering from gunshot wounds or shrapnel injuries. And the envy was toxic. I'd think about my fire team still fighting in Fallujah, still going through doors, and I felt like I'd abandoned them even though intellectually I knew that was insane. You don't choose when you get wounded. You don't choose how your war ends. 3 weeks into my stay at Landstuhl, my platoon commander visited. He'd rotated out of Fallujah temporarily for planning meetings in Germany, and he made time to see the wounded from our battalion. He sat beside my bed and told me about the rest of the operation, about how Kilo Company had pushed through the Jolin and secured our objectives, about the other Marines we'd lost and the ones who'd been wounded. He told me that the house where I'd been hit had yielded a significant weapons cache and documents that led to other successful operations. He told me that the other Marines in the stack behind me had survived that IED with minor injuries because I'd absorbed most of the blast. He told me I'd done my job exactly right, that going through that door first had saved lives. I wanted to believe him. Part of me did believe him. But another part kept asking, at what cost? Was this stump worth whatever tactical advantage we'd gained? Were the weapons we'd captured worth the hand I'd lost? I knew these were the wrong questions, knew that you couldn't calculate the value of military operations in such direct transactional terms. But lying there in that hospital bed with my truncated arm and my uncertain future, those questions were all I had. The nightmares started around week 4. I'd dream about going through doors, except in the dreams the rooms behind them were infinite, each one leading to another door and another explosion, and another piece of me torn away until there was nothing left but a consciousness floating in darkness. I'd wake up sweating, reaching for my rifle with a hand that wasn't there anymore, taking seconds to remember where I was and what had happened. The hospital psychologist said this was normal, said PTSD and traumatic amputation often went hand in hand. An unfortunate choice of words that we both recognized immediately. She prescribed medication and therapy sessions and recommended I start journaling, writing down my thoughts and fears and memories before they could fester. I tried writing, but it was harder than I'd expected. Not just the physical mechanics of learning to write left-handed, though that was frustrating enough. The real difficulty was facing the words, making concrete the swirling chaos of emotion and memory and pain. How do you write about watching your hand get blown off? How do you describe phantom limb pain to someone who's never experienced it? How do you explain that you're simultaneously proud of what you did and devastated by what it cost? By week 6, they fitted me with a temporary prosthetic, a basic myoelectric device that used electrical signals from the muscles in my residual limb to control a simple gripper mechanism. It was clunky and unreliable, and I hated it immediately. The socket chafed against healing tissue. The gripper would randomly open or close based on muscle twitches I couldn't control. It felt like wearing a piece of someone else's body, alien and wrong. Klaus made me use it anyway, made me practice basic tasks until I wanted to throw the damn thing across the room. Some days I did throw it across the room, and Klaus would calmly retrieve it and make me start again. The prosthetist explained that modern technology offered options I'd never imagined. Advanced myoelectric hands with individual finger control, body-powered devices that were more reliable if less sophisticated, activity-specific prosthetics designed for particular tasks. But all of that was months away, dependent on complete healing and extensive training, and the kind of patience I didn't possess. For now, I had this clumsy gripper and my growing collection of one-handed adaptive techniques, and a future that looked nothing like the one I'd imagined when I'd raised my hand to take the oath of enlistment 4 years earlier. They sent me stateside after 2 months in Germany. Bethesda Naval Hospital became my new home, where I joined other amputees in a rehabilitation program that was part physical therapy, part occupational therapy, part psychological counseling, and entirely exhausting. The other guys became my squad. We understood each other in ways that civilians and even non-amputee veterans couldn't. We competed over who could master new tasks first, who could push harder in therapy, who could crack the darkest jokes about our missing parts. Humor became armor against despair. I met a sergeant who'd lost both arms to an IED in Baghdad. I watched him learn to feed himself using prosthetic arms controlled by electrodes implanted in his chest muscles, and suddenly my single amputation seemed almost manageable. I met a lance corporal who'd lost a leg, and who was already running on a blade prosthetic, already talking about competing in adaptive athletics, already planning a future that incorporated his injury instead of being defined by it. These men showed me that survival wasn't the end of the story. It was barely the beginning. But knowing that intellectually and believing it emotionally were different things. I still had days where I couldn't get out of bed, where the weight of everything crushed me flat. I still had nightmares about doorways and explosions. I still felt phantom fingers that would never hold a rifle or shake a hand or touch a woman's face again. The turning point came 9 months after that doorway in Fallujah, though I didn't recognize it as a turning point at the time. I was at Walter Reed Army Medical Center. They'd transferred me there for advanced prosthetic fitting, when a master sergeant from the Wounded Warrior Battalion showed up at my room unannounced. He was missing his left leg below the knee, walking with a slight hitch that you'd only notice if you were looking for it. He didn't introduce himself with sympathy or platitudes. He just said, "You're coming with me tomorrow morning, 0600. Wear PT gear." Then he left before I could argue. I showed up the next morning because you don't ignore a master sergeant, even when you're wounded and feeling sorry for yourself. He took me to a gym where a dozen other amputee Marines and soldiers were already working out, running on treadmills with blade prosthetics, lifting weights with adaptive equipment, doing pull-ups with modified grips and sheer determination. The master sergeant pointed at a rowing machine and said, "Let's see what you've got." I lasted maybe 5 minutes before my residual limb was screaming and my lungs were burning and I had to stop. He nodded like he'd expected exactly that result and said, "Same time tomorrow." I went back the next day and the day after that. Not because I suddenly found motivation or inspiration, but because I was a Marine and Marines don't quit. Even when quitting would be easier than facing another day of pain and frustration and incremental progress that felt meaningless. The workouts were brutal, designed to push us past the limitations we'd internalized, to prove that our injuries didn't define our capabilities. Slowly, grudgingly, I got stronger. My cardiovascular endurance improved. I learned to compensate for my missing hand during exercises, using adaptive equipment and modified techniques. More importantly, I started to believe that maybe, possibly, I could build a life that wasn't just about what I'd lost. The prosthetic technology improved as my residual limb fully healed and the surgical sites matured. They fitted me with a new myoelectric hand, a significant upgrade from the clunky gripper I'd been using. This one had individual finger articulation, proportional control that responded to muscle signal intensity, and sensory feedback that let me feel pressure and temperature through the prosthetic digits. It wasn't my hand, would never be my hand, but it was functional in ways I'd stopped hoping for. I spent hours in occupational therapy learning to use it, practicing everything from typing on a keyboard to handling a coffee cup without crushing it or dropping it. The hardest task was also the most important: weapons handling. If I wanted to stay in the Marine Corps on active duty rather than being medically retired, I needed to prove I could still perform basic combat functions. The adapted firearms training started with pistol qualification. I'd always been right-handed, but now I had to master left-handed shooting while using my prosthetic to support and manipulate the weapon. The first day at the range, I couldn't hit a target at 7 meters. My grip was wrong. My stance was compensating incorrectly. My prosthetic kept losing contact with the weapon at exactly the wrong moment. I went back to my room that night, convinced I was done, that the Marine Corps would thank me for my service and show me the door. But the firearms instructor, a gunnery sergeant who'd lost 3 fingers on his right hand in Afghanistan, wasn't ready to give up on me. He broke down every aspect of my shooting mechanics, rebuilt my technique from the ground up for my new physical reality, spent hours on the range with me until muscle memory started to override my frustration. 2 months later, I qualified expert with the M9 pistol left-handed. It was one of the proudest moments of my life, ridiculous as that might sound. That qualification card meant I wasn't finished, meant I was still a Marine. Rifle qualification was harder. The M16 required bilateral manipulation for reloading, malfunction clearance, and weapons maintenance. I had to learn entirely new techniques, using my prosthetic to hold the weapon while my left hand performed manipulations, developing the fine motor control to seat magazines and operate the charging handle and bolt catch with my non-dominant hand. The prosthetic couldn't feel the subtle feedback that tells you when a magazine is fully seated or when you've achieved proper weapons lock. I had to rely on visual confirmation and rehearsed procedures, slower than I'd been with 2 hands but eventually reliable enough to pass qualification. The Marine Corps offered me options. I could accept a medical retirement with disability benefits and Veterans Affairs support, an honorable end to my service with a steady income and health care for life. Or I could fight to stay on active duty in a limited duty status, likely in a non-combat role given my permanent physical limitations. Most of the Marines I knew who'd been through similar injuries took the retirement. It was the sensible choice, the path that let you move forward with civilian life and put the war behind you. I chose to stay. Not because I had illusions about returning to combat operations, I knew those days were over, but because I wasn't ready to stop being a Marine. The Corps had been my identity since I was 19 years old. The men I'd served with in Fallujah were still my brothers. The mission still mattered, even if my role in it had changed. They assigned me to the Wounded Warrior Regiment, where I worked with newly injured Marines going through the same rehabilitation process I'd just completed. I became the guy who showed up at hospital rooms unannounced, who took fresh amputees to the gym, who proved through my presence that life continued after the injury. It wasn't the career I'd planned. I'd imagined myself as a company first sergeant, maybe even sergeant major if I stayed in long enough, leading Marines in combat the way my mentors had led me. Instead, I was a staff sergeant working in rehabilitation coordination, helping broken warriors find their way back to functionality. Some days that felt like failure, like I'd been demoted from trigger puller to caretaker. Other days, when I watched a young Marine master a task he'd thought impossible, or when I received a message from someone I'd helped telling me he'd just completed a marathon on prosthetic legs. Those days it felt like the most important work I'd ever done. The VA rated me at 70% disability for the amputation and associated PTSD. The monthly compensation helped financially, though no amount of money could replace what I'd lost. I went through vocational rehabilitation, earning certifications in peer counseling and adaptive athletics coaching. I learned about the broader veteran support network, the nonprofit organizations, the adaptive sports programs, the community of wounded warriors who'd found purpose in helping each other survive and thrive. I started speaking at military events and veteran gatherings, telling my story not because I thought it was unique or special, but because sharing it helped both me and the people listening. I talked about that doorway in Fallujah, about the 4 seconds that changed everything, about the long road from that bloody floor to functional independence. I talked about phantom limb pain and prosthetic frustration and the psychological weight of visible injury. I talked about the brothers who'd carried me out of that house, and the medical personnel who'd saved my life, and the other amputees who'd shown me that survival was possible. 5 years after Fallujah, I ran my first marathon. It took me 6 hours and 13 minutes, longer than it would have taken with 2 hands for better balance and bilateral arm swing. But I crossed that finish line on my own power. The master sergeant who'd first dragged me to that gym was waiting at the finish with a beer and a handshake. He didn't say much, just, "Not bad, Marine," but it was enough. 7 years after Fallujah, I met Sarah at a veteran support group. She was an Army combat medic who'd lost her leg to an IED in Kandahar. We understood each other's scars, both visible and invisible. We didn't have to explain the nightmares or the phantom pains or the complicated relationship with our injuries. Our first date was at an adaptive rock climbing gym. She beat me to the top of the wall, and I knew I was in trouble. 10 years after Fallujah, I medically retired from the Marine Corps with an honorable discharge and 18 years of service, close enough to 20, that they let me retire at the next rank with partial pension. The ceremony was small, just my command and some of the Marines I'd worked with in the Wounded Warrior Regiment. They presented me with a shadow box containing my medals, including the Purple Heart I'd received for that doorway in Fallujah, and a plaque commemorating my service. I thought I'd feel relief or sadness or some clear emotion, but mainly, I felt grateful. Grateful I'd survived when others hadn't. Grateful for the second chance to build a life I'd thought was over. I went to work full-time for a nonprofit that provided transition support for wounded veterans. I coached adaptive athletics on weekends. Sarah and I got married in a small ceremony attended by more amputees than whole people. We joked that we had enough spare parts between all the guests to build a complete person. We bought a house with a garage I converted into a workshop where I could tinker with adaptive equipment designs. I learned to use prosthetic hands well enough to do fine detail work, building custom grips and attachments for other amputees who needed specialized tools. The nightmares never completely stopped, but they became less frequent, less intense. I learned to manage the PTSD through therapy and medication, and the support of people who understood. The phantom limb pain became a familiar companion rather than a constant torment, still present, but no longer overwhelming. I stayed connected to my fire team from Fallujah through social media and occasional reunions. 2 of them had also been wounded later in the deployment. One had left the Corps and was teaching high school history. One was still on active duty, a master sergeant now. We didn't talk much about that day, about that doorway, but it lived between us like shared DNA. I went back to Fallujah in 2019, part of a veteran pilgrimage organized by a documentary filmmaker. The city had been rebuilt after being nearly destroyed in the battle. The Jolan district looked nothing like I remembered. New buildings, paved streets, children playing where we'd fought for every meter. I found the compound where I'd lost my hand, or thought I did. Honestly, all those buildings had looked similar in the smoke and chaos. I stood outside and felt nothing, which surprised me. I'd expected some cathartic moment, some emotional release. But there was just a middle-aged Marine with a prosthetic hand standing on a street corner in a city that had moved on from its trauma faster than I had. That night, I wrote in my journal for the first time in years. I wrote about the young corporal I'd been, the one who'd volunteered to be first through the door because he believed in the mission, and his brothers, and his own invincibility. I wrote about what I'd lost, and what I'd gained, and the strange accounting that meant both could somehow be true simultaneously. I wrote about the price of service and whether it had been worth paying, and I still didn't have a clear answer. But I was okay with that ambiguity now in ways I hadn't been when I was younger. I am 42 years old now. I've been an amputee longer than I had my original hand. The prosthetics have improved tremendously. I have multiple hands for different activities, computer-controlled fingers that respond almost naturally, sensory feedback systems that let me feel textures and temperatures. But I still remember what it felt like to have my own hand. Still sometimes reach for things with fingers that aren't there anymore. I've built a good life, a meaningful life. But I'd be lying if I said I wouldn't trade all of it to go back to that doorway in Fallujah and take a different path, avoid that IED, keep my hand and my innocence, and my belief that courage alone could protect you. But that's not how life works. You go through the doors in front of you, and sometimes they explode, and then you figure out how to keep going with whatever pieces you have left. The question people ask most often when they learn my story is whether I regret it. Whether I regret volunteering to be first through that door. Whether I'd do it again, knowing what it would cost. It's an impossible question, because it assumes a version of me that could have known, that could have seen the future and made a different choice. That young corporal stacking up outside that compound in Fallujah, didn't know what waited behind that interior doorway. He just knew his brothers needed someone to go first, and he'd always been the one willing to take that position. Would I erase that choice if I could? Rewrite history so some other Marine triggered that IED instead? The honest answer is, I don't know. And anyone who says they'd know for certain has never really faced that kind of loss. What I do know is this. That doorway defined the rest of my life in ways both devastating and unexpected. I lost my hand, lost the career trajectory I'd planned, lost the easy relationship with my body that people with all their parts take for granted every single day. But I also gained things. Perspective on what actually matters. Connection with a community of wounded warriors who became my second family. Purpose in helping others navigate the same dark roads I'd traveled. The accounting doesn't balance neatly. You can't put one hand on one side of the ledger and deeper understanding of human resilience on the other and pretend they're equivalent trades. Life doesn't work like that, especially not for those of us who've paid physical prices for abstract concepts like duty and honor and brotherhood. I think about the other Marines who went through doors in Fallujah and didn't come home at all. 51 Americans killed in action during Operation Phantom Fury. Hundreds more wounded, many far worse than me. I think about the corpsmen who treated me on that floor, who later received a Bronze Star for treating casualties under fire throughout the battle. I think about my fire team who continued clearing that house after I went down, who finished the mission even though they'd just watched their brother get blown apart. Those men are the real heroes of Fallujah, the ones who kept fighting when everything in them must have screamed to take cover and wait for someone else to take the risks. The legacy of that battle, of that doorway, lives in ways I'm still discovering. I see it in the young amputees I work with who look at my prosthetic hand and my functional life and dare to believe they might have futures too. I see it in the adaptive equipment designs I've helped develop that make daily tasks easier for people navigating the world with missing limbs. I see it in my marriage to Sarah, a relationship that exists because we both understand what it means to sacrifice parts of yourself in service to something larger. I see it in the nonprofit work that lets me transform my trauma into support for other veterans struggling with their own transitions. But the legacy also lives in the darker places, in the nightmares that still come sometimes, in the phantom pains that spike when weather changes or stress rises, in the complicated relationship with Veterans Affairs and disability systems that treat wounded warriors like problems to be managed rather than people to be honored. The suicide rate among wounded veterans is staggeringly high, and I've lost friends to that invisible enemy. Warriors who survived combat, but couldn't survive the peace that followed. Every time I get a call that another veteran I knew has taken his own life, I'm reminded that survival is an ongoing battle, not a destination you reach and then relax. I've spent years thinking about the moral weight of combat, about what it means to have killed people in that Fallujah house and others before it. The infantry doesn't give you the luxury of distance. I saw the faces of men I shot, saw them fall, saw them die. They were trying to kill me and my brothers. And in that moment, the morality was simple. Them, or us. But in the years since, lying awake at 3 a.m. when the prosthetic is off and the phantom hand is screaming, the morality gets more complicated. Those were human beings with families and beliefs and lives that I ended. The fact that it was legal and necessary and in service of my country doesn't erase that fundamental truth. I carry those deaths with me alongside my missing hand, and I suspect I always will. The Second Battle of Fallujah was the bloodiest urban combat American forces had engaged in since Vietnam, perhaps since World War II. We went into that city knowing it would be brutal, knowing the insurgents had prepared extensively, knowing many of us wouldn't come out whole or at all. The strategic importance of Fallujah as an insurgent stronghold, the political necessity of retaking it before Iraqi elections, the tactical challenges of urban warfare, all of that has been analyzed and debated by military historians and strategists. But for those of us who stacked up outside those doors, who went through them into darkness and gunfire and IEDs, the strategic considerations mattered less than the Marine on your left and right, the brother who would drag you out if you went down, the shared commitment to mission accomplishment regardless of cost. Looking back across 20 years, I can see how that battle shaped the evolution of American military tactics in urban warfare, how the lessons learned in Fallujah's brutal house-to-house fighting influenced everything from training protocols to equipment development to rules of engagement in subsequent operations. The Corps got better at breaching, better at IED detection, better at treating traumatic injuries in combat. Those improvements came at the cost of Marines like me who learned the hard way what worked and what didn't. Our scars became data points in after-action reports that made the next generation of warriors slightly safer. I'm proud of that legacy, even as I mourn its necessity. I want younger veterans to understand something that took me years to accept. Your worth is not determined by your wholeness. The military culture emphasizes physical capability, mental toughness, the ability to accomplish the mission regardless of personal cost. That culture builds warriors who will run toward gunfire and go first through doors. But it can also make wounded warriors feel worthless when their bodies can no longer perform at peak levels. I internalized that message after my injury, measured my value by what I'd lost rather than what remained. It took other amputees, therapists, family members, and years of work to understand that my worth as a person, hell, even as a Marine, didn't disappear with my hand. The future of prosthetic technology is advancing faster than I can keep up with. Researchers are developing neural interfaces that connect directly to the nervous system, providing sensation and control that approaches natural limb function. I've tested some of these systems, felt digital approximations of touch and pressure through prosthetic fingers, controlled individual digit movements through thought alone. It's miraculous and inadequate simultaneously. Better than anything available when I was first injured, but still fundamentally different from the hand I was born with. I tell young amputees not to wait for technology to give them their lives back, to build their futures with the tools available now. But I also watch these developments with hope that each generation will have more options than the one before. I've been asked to speak at Marine Corps recruit training, to talk to young men and women about service and sacrifice before they take their oaths. I tell them about Fallujah, about doorways and consequences, about brothers and missions and the prices we sometimes pay. I don't try to talk them out of serving. That choice is too personal and important for me to influence either way. But I want them to understand that the oath they're taking is real, that the sacrifices the recruiters mention aren't abstract concepts, but concrete possibilities. Some of them will go through doors that explode. Some of them will come home missing pieces of themselves. Some of them won't come home at all. And all of them will be changed in ways they can't anticipate by experiences they can't yet imagine. My son, Sarah, and I adopted him 5 years ago when he was 8, after his Marine father was killed in Afghanistan and his mother struggled with addiction. Asks me sometimes about my hand. He was too young when we got him to remember me with the injury fresh, so to him I've always been dad with the robot hand, which he thinks is pretty cool. I've shown him pictures from Fallujah, told him age-appropriate versions of what happened, tried to help him understand that sometimes people get hurt doing important things, and that hurt doesn't make them less capable or valuable. I watch him grow up in a country that's been at war his entire life, that's been at war for most of my adult life. And I wonder what lessons he's learning about service and sacrifice, and whether the costs we've paid have purchased anything lasting. The Marine Corps motto is Semper Fidelis, always faithful. Faithful to country, to Corps, to each other. That faith sustained me through that doorway in Fallujah, and through every difficult day since. Faith that my brothers would come for me if I fell. Faith that my service mattered even when I couldn't see its impact. Faith that I could build something meaningful from the wreckage of my original plans. That faith has been tested repeatedly, by pain and loss and bureaucratic indifference and my own despair. But it hasn't broken. I remain faithful to the ideals that led me to raise my hand and take the oath, even as I've developed a more nuanced understanding of how those ideals interact with political realities and human costs. To the warriors currently serving, especially those in combat roles who might one day face their own doorways, your courage matters, your service matters, you matter. If the day comes when you pay a price for that service, know that your life doesn't end with your injury. The road back is longer and harder than anyone who hasn't walked it can understand, but it's navigable. You'll need to accept help, which is harder for most of us than facing enemy fire. You'll need to redefine your identity and capabilities and future. You'll need to forgive yourself for being human and breakable. But you can build a life worth living on the other side of trauma, and there's an entire community of wounded warriors ready to help you do it. To the families of wounded warriors, your burden is different but no less real than ours. You didn't choose this sacrifice, didn't volunteer for this mission, but you're living with its consequences alongside us. Thank you for the patience during our angry phases, for the support during our despairing phases, for loving us when we're not particularly lovable. We know we're difficult. We know our trauma affects you too. We're grateful in ways we often fail to express. To everyone watching this, everyone who's taken the time to hear this story, remember us. Not with pity. We don't want your pity, but with understanding that freedom and security come at costs paid by real people, with real families, and real futures altered by their service. Support organizations that help wounded warriors transition and heal. Vote for leaders who take seriously the responsibility of sending Americans into combat. Don't thank us for our service and then forget about us when we come home broken. The battle doesn't end when we leave the war zone, it just changes shape. I still think about that doorway sometimes. Still wonder about the alternate timeline where the IED doesn't detonate, or detonates a second later after I've cleared the fatal funnel, or where I'm not on that operation at all. But I've learned to live in this timeline, this version of reality where I'm a 42-year-old former Marine with a prosthetic hand and a complicated relationship with my service, and a life I never planned but have learned to value anyway. The scars, physical and psychological, are permanent. The loss is real. But so is the growth and connection and purpose I've found in the years since that November morning in Fallujah. If this story has moved you, if it's helped you understand something about the cost of service or the resilience of the human spirit, I want to ask something of you. Subscribe to this channel so these stories of real warriors and real sacrifices reach more people. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe another veteran struggling with their own trauma. Maybe a young person considering military service. Maybe someone who's never thought deeply about what we ask of those who serve. Leave a comment telling us your connection to these stories, your own experiences, your thoughts on service and sacrifice. And if you're a wounded warrior watching this and struggling, reach out. To the VA, to veteran service organizations, to other veterans in your community. You're not alone in this fight, and you don't have to navigate it by yourself. These stories matter. These memories matter. The warriors who paid prices for our freedom matter. By engaging with this content, by sharing it, by keeping these histories alive, you're honoring their sacrifices and ensuring the next generation understands what service truly means. That's the legacy that outlasts any individual injury or battle. The collective memory of what we endured and why it mattered.